lot of people call this next case the incident at Exeter. So this took place on September 3rd in 1965, and Exeter is in New Hampshire. Part of it took place in Kensington, New Hampshire, which is very close to Exeter.
Okay.
So sometime during that evening, the Exeter police officer, Eugene Bertrand, was on patrol, and he observed a distressed woman on the side of Highway 108 on the shoulder of the road. And she was, acting erratic and trying to flag him down. And when he stopped to speak with her, she said that there had been a large UFO. This UFO supposedly followed her for about 12 miles and then hovered over her car and then took off.
So is there any U.S. Air Force base? I mean, obviously...
There is. There is a U.S. Air Force base not far from there called...
Canadian, too, maybe.
Pease Air Force Base. Eventually, this UFO flew away, according to her. And Officer Bertrand thought at the time, hey, maybe this lady's been drinking. So, yeah, he probably thought she was either drinking or delusional or something like that.
Right.
At approximately 2 a.m., there was a young man. He was 18 at the time. His name was Norman Muscarello. And he was walking home on Highway 150. And when he came upon this farmhouse that was owned by the Dining family, as he came across where there are some large stones on the edge of the property along the highway there.
Right.
When he got to one of the larger stones, that's when he noticed that there were some red lights that were illuminating over the woods.
Okay.
Between the house and the farm, the barn.
The barn. Okay.
So he could see off in the distance there were these red lights. He said that suddenly these lights started coming his direction, and he freaked out, as I'm sure anyone probably would at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're 18 years old walking home on the highway. So he dove into a ditch on the side of the road, right, hoping that they wouldn't see him or something,
Yeah.
And so when he did that, the lights started moving back towards the woods.
Also, his timing was approaching.
It was approaching him, and then when he dove into the ditch, it started moving away. So when it moved far enough away, he decided, I'm going to run over to the house and see if I can get inside, see if they'll let me in so I could be safe.
Oh, so to those people's house.
He went to the people's house, started banging on the door. Nobody was home.
Yeah.
Or if they
At
were,
2 a.m. I mean,
they didn't answer.
Yeah.
They didn't answer the door, but he says that they weren't home. Once he realized that no one was there, he just started running down the highway, trying to get as far away from there as he could. So as he was running, a car was coming down the highway. He jumped in front of the car and stopped them. And, they said, you've got to take me to the police station. Something's happened. You've got to take me to the police station. So they drove him to the Exeter police station, which was the closest nearby station. And at that time, police officer Reginald Tolan was managing the desk that night.
Okay.
And so he told Officer Tolan, what had happened to him. So, he was a little skeptical,
perhaps he's just a light following him.
He's a young kid, and maybe he misinterpreted something or whatever. As I said before, Eugene Bertrand had an incident with this woman who also reported a UFO with red lights.
Right.
So he said, maybe there's something to this.
Right. If there's two witnesses.
Two people saw something.
Different location, not knowing each other.
With red lights.
Right.
Different location. So he drove Muscarello back to where the UFO had been, where he had seen it. When they drove back to this location and they got to the farmhouse, they got out of the vehicle and they started walking towards the woods.
Right.
And as they did that, the nearby dogs started howling. Like all the
howling,
dogs.
not barking, howling.
No, they were howling. They weren't They weren't
Right.
barking. They were howling, like crying, right? And then the horses in the stable started kicking
Out the doors,
and making
yeah.
all kinds of noise, right? So they were like, what is going on? And just at that time, Muscarello said, look. And he pointed and showed that it was coming out of the woods again. Officer Bertrand, he described the object as a large, dark, circular object with 5 red lights on it that the object was as big as a barn, he said.
Wow, that's pretty big.
So big as a barn in the sky over the woods, coming their direction. And he said it was about 45 feet in diameter. So at this point, he became frightened and he pulled out his police revolver and he pointed it at the UFO. And then he had a second thought, like, I don't think this little bullet is really going to do anything to that. And even if I do, what if they got something worse to shoot back at me?
Or it bounced back or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. Who knows?
He ended up putting his gun back away, but he called him and Muscarello went back to the police vehicle and he called for backup. At this point, the object was about 100 feet away and about 100 feet in altitude. And it was hovering, but it was swaying back and forth slowly.
That's pretty close, though, for an
It's
object,
pretty close.
an object of that size.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. So if you think it's 45 feet in diameter and it's 100 feet away, it's pretty close.
There's really no sound description.
They said that there was no sound.
Smell and no
Right,
smell or
right.
yeah.
No one mentioned any sound coming from the object, which they normally would.
Yeah, they normally
They would
would
say
if
a
it's
buzzing,
a hiss
humming,
or- yeah.
something. But
Vibration or something.
right,
And then,
exactly. They didn't feel anything. They
and
didn't
here
smell
it's
anything.
very
Didn't
strange.
hear anything.
It's just the visual.
Right, it's just a
Lights.
visual. So Officer David Hunt was the one who responded. And when he arrived, they all get out of their vehicles and they start walking out towards the woods again.
Other woods.
So at this point, Muscarello says, there it is. And they all see it. All 3 of them see it again.
Wow.
So
Pretty count.
he's seen it 3 times. Bertrand's seen it twice. And this is the first time that Hunt is seeing it. They said that the object had 5 red lights.
Right.
So imagine the object, was round,
Circular.
and then 5 red lights in a row, and it was almost like the Knight Rider. They said that it took 2 seconds to make a full.
So they had time
cycle.
to analyze the cycle of those lights.
They analyzed the cycle. It took about 1 second,
Oh,
one
okay.
direction, 1 second the other
Gotcha.
direction. So as they were watching this, they were amazed at this thing. The UFO slowly flew back into the woods, over the top of the woods,
Right.
in the direction of Hampton, New Hampshire. Police Officer Hunt stated that after this happened, after it disappeared from view, he saw a B-49 bomber flying towards the area where the UFO had disappeared. At some point, not that evening, because the chief's not in overnight, maybe the next day or the 2 days later, whatever.
Right.
The police chief called Pease Air Force Base, which is the closest Air Force base to Exeter.
Okay, so that's the Air Force base you were
Right,
telling me about.
right.
Okay.
So he called the base, and they sent out 2 investigators. Okay, they sent out Air Force Major David Griffin and Lieutenant Alan Brandt. It was a response to him reporting it. And first, they met with the 2 police officers and interviewed them,
All right.
separately.
Yeah.
So they get the stories right. After they interviewed the 2 police officers, they went to Muscarello's home. And when they arrived, his mother was in the kitchen, and she answered the door. And they came in and said, "Where's your son?" And she said, "He's in the living room." And they just stormed in. They didn't even say, "Can we go in there?" They just walked into the living room. And then they said, "What do you think you saw?"
Intimidation method.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They said to him, "What do you think you saw? You didn't see
Typical.
that.
Yep.
You didn't see anything." And they told him to shut up.
Yeah.
Eventually, their report, because it was an Air Force report, made it to Project Blue Book.
Of course it did.
Right? Of course, right? And Blue Book's analysis was 2-pronged.
Right.
Okay. The first thing is that what all of these men saw was a temperature inversion, which we talked about before.
The ventilical cloud, hot
Exactly.
and cold, going
hot
over
and
mountains,
cold, air masses,
creating
lights reflecting off and bouncing
Right.
down. So that was one. Number two, there happened to be an Air Force operation going on that night called Operation Big Blast, where they were using B-47s, which one of the officers saw,
right.
and they were being refueled during this process. Whatever lights the B-47s had,
Right.
there would be other lights next to them because there would be another plane there. And where that refueling arm comes down,
yeah,
there are
there's
lights there.
Right.
And some people say it's the same sequence that they saw.
Right.
So like I was saying,
very
this was a strategic air command exercise with these B-47s. After this report came back, or, they somehow found out from the Air Force, they actually wrote to the Air Force and said, hey,
What's up?
right.
Yo,
It took a long time to get a response.
Yeah, because they have to think what to say.
But when these three men wrote to the Air Force and told them exactly what they saw,
Right.
to put together with whatever was collected by the Air Force, they, put these statements as part of this file, right? The Air Force was very slow to respond, as they usually are. But even with this additional information, the only thing that the Air Force said was, at this point, they couldn't identify what they saw.
It was.
But before they said it was
Yeah, it
these
was-
two other things. Now
Right.
they're saying, we don't know what it is. And that was kind of the end of it.
Oh, that's very strange because they could have covered their butt saying, "Oh, it's this done."
Right.
But
So there was a UFO researcher named Raymond E. Fowler. And at the time, he was an investigator for NICAP, which is the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena.
we talked.
It's a private.
Right. We talked about it in a previous episode.
Right.
Yeah,
So interestingly, when that first started, there were a lot of CIA agents in there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
They had planted some people in there to find out what's going on. He, at the time, was an investigator for NICAP. Later on, he became an investigator for MUFON.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, good for him.
Yeah. He did a very intensive investigation of this particular incident.
Oh, did he?
And eventually he wrote a book entitled Incident at Exeter. And his report was so detailed that it was included in the April 5th, 1966 House Armed Services Committee on UFOs. There were only two witnesses that were called to the stand. This was a subcommittee for Congress.
Oh, okay.
For the House of Representatives.
Okay. So very small.
So
yeah.
Dr. J. Allen Hynek was one of the only, witnesses. And at that time, he was the one who said, "Oh, it was swamp gas and stuff like that." So this happened around that same time.
Wow. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
As-
And
as
I
those
think that's,
other
I
incidents.
think the photos we have from Hynek at the microphone. I think that's
Exactly.
from this,
that came later.
Right,
that came
right.
later.
Oh, okay.
But it's interesting that his report was submitted as evidence for
Yeah.
this.
So for something official.
Right. And it's
Right.
actually in
In the
congressional record.
I know it's in the part of history.
Right.
Right. Very strange and cool at the same time for him. So that's it.
That's it.
Wow, great
If
subject.
you have any more
Yeah.
information on this incident, or
or any people
Norman
you know,
Muscarello,
yeah, any of those guys, wow, very interesting and very like so much conspiracy theories can emerge from this, right? If you
right?
wow. Well, thank you for the enlightenment.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll see you next time
On
on
Inside the SCIF.